This video is to help get you through the speciation and extinction notes. The first term for you to define in this chapter is macroevolution. This is different from microevolution, which is change over small periods of time that you can see in like bacteria and fruit flies. Macroevolution, you have to be looking at the fossil record to see it, and so you can see things change a great deal in their body shape over millions or even billions of years. And so it's just evolution on a larger time scale, essentially. For this chapter, we're going to be talking mostly about once a species gets here, how do you keep it as one single species? And so you have to know what a species is. And unfortunately, there's like a dozen different definitions of species. This one's kind of the simplest one, but it's also the most vague, so a distinct type of organism. So this is a lion. It's different from a tiger. So lions and tigers are two separate species. Now again, this chapter is going to be about how do you keep those as separate species. It is possible for lions to mate with tigers, not naturally, but you can do it in certain settings, and when that happens, you create a hybrid, which is called a liger. There's other examples of that, like there's such a thing as a Pizzly bear, which is a polar bear, and a grizzly bear. When they mate together, most people know the example of if you mate a donkey with a horse, you get a mule. Those are all hybrids. Hybrids don't form under natural conditions usually, but if humans get involved and start mating things together, you can. But ordinarily, lions and tigers don't really want to, let's say, have sex with each other just for fun, and so they're going to stay as two completely separate species. Carl Linnaeus is one of the first people who really tried to start putting rules in place in terms of what a species was and how do you name it. This is the picture of Linnaeus, and there are lots of organisms that their scientific name was created by Linnaeus, and it's held for 300 years, and so this was his definition. It worked at the time, but back then we didn't have really good microscopes. We didn't know about bacteria. We didn't know about some of our smaller protists and things, and so we had to make our definition get a little bit broader over time. Linnaeus is also the person who came up with the binomial naming system, which everything has a two-part scientific name. Essentially what it boils down to is you get a Latin version of the name. The first name is the genus in the taxonomic scale, and then the last name is the species epithet. For example, humans are Homo sapiens. That's our binomial or scientific name. A live oak tree is Quercus virginianus. That's their scientific name. So everything has its own. There's another definition of a species that works really well for animals, and so that's the one I'm going to tend to go by as I go through the rest of this chapter. It was developed by Ernst Mayr, who is a professor, I believe, at Harvard. The biological species concept is not just organisms that look the same must be the same, it's organisms that can breed together under natural conditions must be the same. The reason why he came up with that definition was there used to be, and there actually still are, lots of birds that were misclassified because of something called sexual dimorphism. These two birds are both eclecticus parrots. I think the red and the blue one is the male, but I'm not an eclecticus parrot person, so I'm not sure. But usually for birds, the brightly colored one is the male and the kind of drabby one is the female. These used to be classified as two separate species because they look really different from each other. However, under natural conditions, these guys breed together, so that means they're members of the same species. And so he's the one who came up with this different definition to try to come up with what a species actually is, and he tied it to reproduction, which ties it back to genetics and phylogeny and things that we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. Speciation is the creation of new species. You can see this in the fossil record because all of a sudden some new fossil will pop up that we didn't have any history of before that point. You can see it in real time with really small things that have a very fast reproductive rate, but for the most part you got to be looking at the fossil record to be able to see the creation of a species. A gene pool represents all the genes that are present within a population. If the genes change significantly enough, then the species changes. Most people know that humans have very similar DNA to chimps, but we're different enough that we have two different gene pools, plus, thank God, humans don't breed with chimps, and so we're completely separate species. And so even though our DNA is very similar, we do have separate gene pools because we're not mating with each other. The limitations for the biological species concept is you can only apply that to organisms that sexually reproduce. So you can't use it for bacteria, you can't use it for a lot of protists. While plants do technically have sex, they don't do it the same way. It's hard to tell which plants are having sex with which other plants, and so it's a little bit more difficult with plants as well. This is a picture to remind you our earliest forms of life were prokaryotic. These were stromatolites, and they're being prokaryotes, they don't do sex or sexual reproduction, and so we can't use the biological species concept with them. We can't use it with extinct organisms because, again, we don't know who was mating with who, and so for all we know, this organism was breeding with a T-Rex. Probably weren't, but we don't know because we weren't there, and so you can't use this species concept if you can't tell who was mating with who. Some organisms, like that lion and tiger example on the first or second slide, they can interbreed, but they wouldn't do so in nature, and so they are still separate species even though they can. Same thing with the horse and the mule off down here. They can make a hybrid, but there's usually something wrong with the hybrid. It very often ties back to the hybrid ends up being infertile, as in the case of the mule, and so this definition works really well for most animals, but there's not really one perfect definition of a species, and so just kind of keep that in mind as we go through here. Compare and contrast your prezygotic and postzygotic reproductive barriers, or things that keep separate species as separate species. So prezygotic means we're not even going to make a baby. Postzygotic usually means we're going to make a baby, but there's going to be something wrong with that baby. And so these are the two things that are trying to prevent in nature a horse from mating with a donkey. Okay, the first 5 that we're going to talk about here, these are all going to be prezygotic barriers. I'll mention that again at the end so you can make sure you get it in your notes. Ecological isolation is also called habitat isolation. So these two snakes, they both live in South Carolina. They're fairly close to each other, but they're in different types of habitat within the same area. So even though you can find them both in the same park, for example, they're not going to run into each other because this one's in the watery area in the park and this one's more in the foresty area of the park. And so since they're hanging out in different habitat within that same park, they're going to not run into each other. And, you know, it's hard to have sex with somebody you never meet. And so that's ecological isolation. Temporal isolation. Most things on the planet have a breeding season. And if your breeding season doesn't match somebody else's breeding season, it means you can't mate together. And that's the case of these 2 pine trees. We have a Monterey pine and a bishop pine. One of them, they throw their pollen out in February, and the other one does it a couple months later. And so because their pollen releasing seasons are at different times, they can't mate with each other. This works a lot for deer and birds and things that have a very specific breeding season, a limited breeding season. Humans don't work this way at all, and so we don't do temporal isolation. Behavioral isolation. A lot of different things, birds especially, there's a very elaborate courtship ritual that has to happen where it's usually the guys that have to work harder. They have to sing and dance and put on a show, and if you don't dance right or sing right, the female is going to choose to not have sex with you. That's a type of behavioral isolation. You can go onto YouTube and watch a video. This is a bird of paradise. He puts on this huge elaborate display where he is fluffed up and he's showing his iridescent feathers, and even after all this dance, this chick was like, not really all that interested, and she just ran off and didn't have sex with him. And so that happens a lot for behavioral isolation. Fireflies also do this. So fireflies, when they're doing their flickery thing in the summer, they're flickering at a specific frequency that tells other members of their species that they are ready for sex. And if they flicker at the wrong frequency, their species doesn't recognize them, and so they would be behaviorally isolated. So it essentially just means you're doing gross things and I don't want to have sex with you. That's how behavioral isolation works. Mechanical isolation essentially means the parts don't fit. These 2 snails, even though they look super similar to each other, their genitals are on opposite sides of the body, and you can't really wrap a penis like around and under to get it to the hole that's on the correct side. And so even though these 2 would apparently like to have sex with each other, they can't because they can't line their parts up together. And so that's mechanical isolation. Gametic isolation. This one's important for organisms that kind of throw their gametes out. So anything that spawns in water, like a sea urchin, they just fling sperm and egg out into the ocean and hope they run together. Plants, especially plants that are wind pollinated, they're just flinging their sperm out and hoping it finds the eggs eventually. So you've, unbeknownst to you, had sex with a pine tree at some point in your life, which is a really creepy thing to think about, but you've never gotten pregnant because, well, either you're a boy or because their sperm can't actually bond with your eggs, not to mention hopefully it didn't get up in that general region. But Anyway, that would be gametic isolation. It's the sperm and the egg can't actually bond together because the receptors don't match, and as a result, babies don't get made. So that's why sea urchins don't impregnate sponges. It's because their gametes don't actually fuse together. So all of the last 5 things that we mentioned, ecological, temporal, behavioral, mechanical, and gametic isolation, those all prevent different species from making a baby to begin with. And so they are keeping separate species as separate by preventing hybrids from forming. The next 3 that we're going to talk about are all post-zygotic barriers. So 2 different species come together and they do have sex and they make a baby, but there's usually something wrong with the baby. And so the first one of those is hybrid inviability. And what this means is the babies don't survive for very long. This is a species of salamander, and there's another species that lives right next to them, and they aren't separated enough that they know not to have sex with each other, so they do. And when those 2 species make babies, the babies usually die within a couple of weeks of being born, so they never hit reproductive maturity. And so that's an example of hybrid inviability. Hybrid infertility is the whole horse, donkey creating a mule thing. Mules are infertile. They can't reproduce. And so that is reduced hybrid fertility. The liger usually also works that way. So the tiger lion makes a liger thing. The liger is usually infertile. The other option is nature's last-ditch effort to keep 2 separate species as 2 separate species. So the 2 separate species have sex with each other. They make a baby, and the baby is awesome. Sometimes the baby is even more robust than either of the 2 parents were, and the baby can even reproduce, although usually back to one of the parents, and then the babies of that mating don't work out. And so the second generation, there's something wrong with the second generation. That's how hybrid breakdown works. A lot of our crops work that way, so the reason why cotton can produce so much cotton per boll, which is this little thing right here, a cotton boll, is because they're hybrids, and so they're also, you can't mate them back to create additional plants. It's another way that companies also help to keep their money flowing, but that's hybrid breakdown. Alright, so those last 3, anything that makes a hybrid, that's going to be a post-zygotic barrier, but again, there's usually going to be something wrong with that hybrid. Okay, next up, when you look at the fossil record, there's different methods that we can create new species, and they're kind of clumped into 2 categories, allopatric and sympatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, there is some kind of barrier that prevents 2 organisms from ever running into each other, and if they can't run into each other, they can't mate. So for example, in this situation, we got these 2 chipmunky things off over here. And let's say this one sees this one across the canyon and thinks this is the sexiest chipmunk he's ever seen in his whole entire life. Is he really going to hop all the way down the side of this cliff, go across this river that may or may not have lots of water flowing through it, climb all the way up to the tippy-toe top, and then she's still going to be here waiting for him by the time he gets back up over there? No. That's a barrier preventing these 2 guys from reproducing. Once that barrier is in place, it means the population on the south side is going to keep reproducing with populations over here, and they're going to change following their own evolutionary path. The guys up here in the north, they're going to reproduce with more guys on the north, and then they're going to follow their own little evolutionary path. And so these 2 populations are going to diverge down their own paths because they're not mating with each other anymore. So the whole key to allopatric is there has to be some sort of a barrier that is preventing 2 populations from mating together anymore, and as a result of that barrier, they go down their own paths of evolution. A little side note that's important for allopatric speciation, the size of the barrier totally depends on the kind of organism you have. So for example, this canyon, it's a barrier to these 2 chipmunk populations reproducing, but if you have a California condor over here and another one over here, this is not a barrier that's going to prevent those 2 condors from mating with each other. So the size of the barrier really does depend on the mobility of the creature. So keep that in mind as you're kind of going through here. Second option, sympatric speciation. We're in the same area. There is nothing geographically that is preventing 2 populations from mating with each other, but speciation still occurs. This is usually due to they have different food sources, or a new mating dance comes up, and so if you don't dance right, that population doesn't go together. Polyploidy is maybe we've gained additional layers of chromosomes, so we can't mate back with the original population because we have a different number of chromosomes that they have. There's a bunch of reasons why this might happen, but the key to it is there's not a barrier. There's something else in play that is preventing these 2 populations from merging with each other. So this could kind of be like these ecological barriers that were developed up over here. Again, these guys were in the same place. There was nothing preventing them from mating with each other except they're hanging out in slightly different places. So this could be a type of sympatric speciation if those populations keep diverging down their own paths. Another example, cichlids in Lake Victoria. When the water is very clear, it used to be very clear, the fish actually had eyes that could see the color of that was similar to them more easily, and so this fish could see its colors better and think, hey, that's a bright, showy, sexy fish off over there, but he wouldn't see the fish of opposite colors because his eyes weren't primed to see those colors, and so he wouldn't find this fish sexy. As the water has gotten murkier, things are starting to switch around there, but because of that whole eye seeing certain pigments better and the water being clear, that was preventing these guys from mating with each other because of just sexual preference. He didn't find this one sexy because the colors weren't bright enough for him to be visually appealing. Alright, so as you look through this question right here, let's see, there are several other species pairs like these meadowlarks in the Great Plains. Some are considered separate species and others aren't, even though they do appear quite different. Which of the following might have geographically isolated these different bird populations, leading to speciation? Well, it's not going to be a river because a bird can fly over a river really easily. Recent geologically continental glaciation. So there did used to be a huge glacier that covered a big swath of North America down what is currently the Mississippi River. And these birds would not have been able to fly over that glacier, and so that is what tended to keep them separate. So this is the right answer. Prairie fires just in one time of the year, that's not really going to do it. And hurricanes definitely does blow birds around, but it doesn't usually prevent birds from mating with each other. So B is the right answer out of all of those. All right. Back page, gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. These are patterns that we see as we look at the fossil record. In gradualism, when we look at the fossil record, we see a bunch of different intermediate paths that get us slowly from one species to a different species. So the species gradually changes over time to what we have currently, essentially. Punctuated equilibrium works differently. Instead, what happens is suddenly in the fossil record, one species switched into two species, and it seemed to happen overnight. Now, part of the fossil record may have been gone, but it's possible that just that change did happen really fast, and so we got two species. Now, it's punctuated by then those two species stay exactly the same for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, and so you get this equilibrium after this really quick change. Adaptive radiation is something that you see a lot of whenever a species makes it to a new place, or if there has been a mass extinction, you can see adaptive radiations that occur after that. Some examples of adaptive radiation would be the finches that Darwin saw as he was traipsing around the Galapagos Islands. Finches are related to mockingbirds in their own little way. And the hypothesis is that some storm, which again, storms do blow birds around, some storm blew several birds over to these islands, and there were no other birds on these islands. And so they had all of these food sources that were available to them. And so we got a bunch of new birds that bred in that place. And then they started to specialize so that some of them started to eat small seeds. Some of them started to eat cactus flowers and fruits. Some of them started to eat bugs that were in there, and their beaks started to specialize based on the foods that they were eating so that they weren't competing with each other for resources. And so what blew over there as one species of bird gradually changed into lots of different species. That's adaptive radiation. Extinction is the next word that you have. This is a species dies out completely. That is happening all the time. So the background extinction rate is just sort of the number of species that go extinct at any given time. As you kind of look at this picture off down here, this is showing you the number of different families that were alive during different times. Anytime there's this sharp drop, that's a mass extinction, but there's always species that are going extinct, and that's the background extinction rate. I have another picture of that to kind of show you if it helps to explain that. Mass extinctions are extinction events that have exceeded the background extinction rate. So what they've highlighted here in green on this picture, those are background extinctions that are just always happening. Anytime we get this huge spike, though, in the extinction rate, that's a mass extinction event. And there have been 5. We are arguing about whether or not we're in a 6th mass extinction event based on what humans are doing to the planet and poaching and habitat loss and other things that we're going to talk about later on. So we might be in a 6th. It just kind of depends on who you talk to there. This mass extinction, that last one that's on this graph, that was when the dinosaurs were wiped out, but there were a lot of other mass extinctions that happened as well. So the dinosaurs, what is believed to have caused their mass extinction based on evidence at this point is that a very large meteor crashed into Earth right around the Yucatan Peninsula that's sort of in Central America. That set off several problems. One, it threw a lot of dust into the atmosphere, so there was a period of cooling that happened afterwards. Two, it threw off this huge tidal wave that actually wiped ocean like up into where we live right now, though there was probably a shallow sea back then as well in our area, but there was still this tidal wave that would have wiped out a bunch of species that are in our area. But because it is believed that most dinosaur species were ectothermic or cold-blooded, when the atmosphere cooled, they couldn't keep themselves warm. They had problems with thermoregulation, and because plants wouldn't have been as good at doing what plants do, they would have also run out of food. So that was the last mass extinction. It was because of something that happened external to the Earth but became internal. Okay, systematics. This is classifying organisms. It's kind of the thing that Linnaeus came up with back in the day. This is the book he wrote, Systema Naturae, where he described taxonomic classification and the hierarchies. If you guys remember, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Those are the systems, the hierarchy that we group things into. We didn't know about domains back during Linnaeus' time. It started with kingdom for him, but most of the rest of his stuff is still in play today. Some things to mention about scientific names. We use them because a lot of times common names are very ambiguous. The examples that I'm giving you here, so these are both skunks. Anybody would probably just call them skunks, but they are two completely separate species of skunks. If I remember right, this is Mephidus and then this is Spilogale. They're not even in the same genus. That's how different they are. And yet most people would just call them skunks. And so using a scientific name gives you a little bit more clarity about what species you're talking about. The other thing to mention here is common names a lot of times don't make any fish. Like a jellyfish isn't a fish, a starfish isn't a fish, crawfish isn't a fish, silverfish isn't a fish. So this is a cnidarian, this is an echinoderm, this is an arthropod, this is a different arthropod. And so using these common names, it can be confusing when you're talking to people because they don't often make a lot of sense. And so the scientific name is unambiguous. You know exactly what it is, and the scientific name is the same here as it is in Mexico, as it is in Argentina, as it in Namibia, whatever. Everybody uses the same scientific name. So what gives an organism its scientific name is the science of taxonomy. So you discover a species, you get to name it, so you would be carrying out taxonomy to name that species. Now, one of the things that we try to do whenever we do assign names is we try to also group it into what systems it's supposed to go into, what taxa it's supposed to go into. And we don't just say like, well, I think this is a dog, I'm going to put it in the dog group. Instead, we look at what it might be related to based on DNA evidence at this point. And so what we can do is create what's known as a phylogenetic tree. This helps us figure out, well, who is it more related to? Like if you were to go find something that the residents called it a chupacabra, and you want to know if a chupacabra is a dog or is it an otter or is it a cat, you could run the DNA analysis and then figure out who is it more closely related to, which P.S. there's no such thing as a chupacabra. But if we did find something, we could put it up there and then we would know who it's more closely related to. And then we would know, well, does it need to go into the Canidae family because it's a dog, or does it need to go into the Felidae family because it's a cat? So phylogenetics just helps us group organisms based on similarities nowadays in DNA sequences, but in the old days it was just based on the body plan and what does it look like it's more related to. So that is kind of how we define species and how species can become new species, or once we do have new species, how we can keep separate species as separate species. Hopes that help you with this next chapter. From here, make sure you take the speciation and extinction quiz in Blackboard.